Hour 1. In the Pacific, Chinese amphibious invasion forces stream out of civilian and military ports along the eastern Chinese coast. The massive fleet is a mix of military and civilian ships, including commercial ferries with reinforced ramps to allow them to on- and offload heavy military vehicles. This first wave of invaders is 35,000 strong, and many more tens of thousands of soldiers are waiting for their turn to make the 100-mile journey to Taiwan. Chinese frigates scour the waters of the Taiwan Strait on the hunt for American or Taiwanese submarines. A formal declaration of war against Taiwan is being declared as the ships cut through the waves. And though no declaration of war against the United States is prepared, it's fully expected that the United States will honor its commitment to defend Taiwan from invasion. Any sub in the Taiwan Strait that doesn't belong to the People's Liberation Army Navy will be considered hostile and fired upon. A world away, Russian forces staging out of Belarus and the Western Military District launch an offensive into the Baltic countries. The featureless, flat plains of Eastern Europe are perfect tank country and favor the attacker, with few natural features to build defenses on. Overhead, a barrage of missiles preempts the crossing of Russian troops into NATO territory. Hundreds of ballistic and cruise missiles fly across Eastern Europe, aimed at NATO airfields, supply depots, and troop staging areas. Aegis ashore facilities and other anti-missile defenses begin to light up the sky with their own counterfire. The average success rate of missile defense systems averages between 50 and 60%, but that still means over 100 missiles find their targets, cratering airfields, destroying fuel depots, and killing hundreds on the ground. But NATO hasn't been blind to the buildup of military troops by Russia, and the moment the first wave of missile strikes are detected and still in the air, NATO responds accordingly. The skies are so crowded with missiles for a few minutes that it's unsafe for NATO or Russia's combat air patrols to operate in the region, and they take to low altitude for safety. NATO's missiles have better precision than Russia's missiles, but Russian missile defenses are slightly more effective than NATO's. In the Pacific, China launches nearly 600 missiles in the span of an hour, the largest missile barrage in human history. These missiles target Taiwan's military and civilian airfields, hangars, command and control nodes, and electric power plants. However, a significant number of them also target American air bases in Guam, Japan, and South Korea. American and Taiwanese missile defenses put up a brave fight, but the overwhelming fire is too much, and many of the missiles find their marks. Guam is cratered by ballistic missile strikes, and America's largest military base in the Pacific is temporarily knocked out of commission. Thousands die on the ground. Further missile attacks target American naval vessels operating in the Pacific. China has needed 4 months to prepare its amphibious assault fleet, giving the world plenty of time to prepare for the coming war. The U.S. now operates 4 carrier groups in the Pacific, with a 5th in reserve along the American west coast. As American satellites detect the start of the Chinese attack, a warning is sent across the entire American Pacific Fleet. The carriers now move at full speed, taking random and aggressive turns, all in an attempt to throw off the targeting of China's missiles. American cyber and electronic warfare operations, however, are already underway. Targeting China's recon and targeting assets, they succeed in degrading the accuracy of China's missiles, but the sheer number of them still makes them a serious threat. As the missiles re-enter the atmosphere at several thousand miles an hour, American missile defenses put up a wall of lead and steel, with escort cruisers knocking out Chinese missiles with their own SM-3 missiles. When the smoke clears, 1 American carrier has been sunk, 2 have been seriously damaged, the 3rd has suffered only minor damage. Many of the carrier group escorts, however, are severely damaged or sunk. The U.S. Navy has just experienced the largest single-day loss of life in its history. Hour 2. On the ground in Eastern Europe, Russian forces are making contact with the first line of NATO defenses. The NATO Rapid Response Force has dug in best as it can along the eastern flank of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. But the flat ground doesn't give much defensive advantage to NATO. NATO tanks are on the whole more modern and more capable than Russian tanks, thanks to crippling sanctions imposed on Russia after its annexation of Crimea in 2014, and additional sanctions in 2022 after its invasion of Ukraine. Other than destroying the Russian economy, the blockade of computer chips from major manufacturers such as Taiwan have been a devastating blow to a military already suffering from worn-out and poorly maintained equipment. This has had a cascading effect across the Russian military, as much of the smart tech of modern militaries relies heavily on computer components, which Russia is now forced to manufacture domestically. Everything from modern anti-tank missiles to air-to-air missiles and even fire control radar have a limited reserve supply and must be applied judiciously. The T-72 still makes the bulk of Russian forces, though in preparation for war several thousand Cold War-era tanks have been activated. These tanks suffer from serious deficiencies against modern weapons and are largely used as cannon fodder by the Russians. Scores of T-55s, T-62s, and T-64s smash into NATO defenses, soaking up anti-tank fire while more modern T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s mop up exhausted defenders. Casualties are horrendous for the Russians, but they have plenty of outdated equipment to throw into the fight. NATO's tanks are far more capable than most Russian tanks, but they're also more expensive and significantly fewer in number. The United States is still in the process of shipping the bulk of its armored forces to Europe, but it'll be several weeks yet before significant amounts of American armor is ready for combat. For now, Europe must hold the line long enough for the US to bring its full firepower into the fight, assisted of course by a few thousand advanced American forces stationed in Europe. Combat in the air is just as intense on the ground. Within minutes of the war's start, both sides' air forces took to the skies. Russian MiGs are capable aircraft, but again facing serious modernity problems from a lack of funding. However, while the Russian army has a reputation earned in Ukraine for poor tactics, communications, and performance, the Russian Air Force remains a competent and credible threat to NATO. Both sides are unable to bring the full power of their air forces to bear against each other. For NATO planes, the threat comes from Russia's numerous air defense batteries, which operate close to the front lines and can even threaten NATO planes from within Russia's borders. The S-400 system ranks among the best air defense systems in the world and is lethal to NATO's 4th and 4.5 generation fighters. At immediate and close range, numerous self-propelled air defense guns shore up S-400 and older S-300 defenses. NATO, on the other hand, relies heavily on fighters and interceptors for air defense, whom themselves are at risk from Russian ground-based defenses. However, NATO enjoys one distinct advantage over Russia: the F-35 stealth fighter and America's fleet of F-22 air supremacy fighters. Unfortunately, only a few hundred F-35s are capable of combat operations across the NATO alliance, and most of these are from the United States. The vaunted F-22, the most capable air supremacy fighter in the world, is also in very low numbers, and most of them are being diverted to bases in the Pacific for sea and air war against China. Entire fleets of American aircraft are already making the Atlantic crossing with the aid of tanker planes, but it'll be a day or two yet before they're ready for combat ops. Europe's lack of stealth fighters means they can't safely operate near the front lines, temporarily giving the air advantage to Russia. Russia presses that advantage as best it can, but carrying out strike missions over the front lines is still hazardous business for its air force. Russian bombers devastate NATO defenses, but take casualties of their own. Long-range standoff attacks via air-launched cruise missiles keep Russian pilots out of harm's way. NATO responds with its own long-range strikes, but for now the air over the front belongs to Russia. Attack helicopters from both sides fight ground defenses and each other all across the front. It'll take time yet for NATO to gather its forces, and the numbers advantage is once more in Russia's favor. Still, both sides suffer heavy losses of air cavalry to man-portable air defense weapons and traditional air defenses both. As the second hour of World War III comes to a close, a massive offensive out of the military enclave of Kaliningrad pushes into NATO defenses in southern Lithuania. Further cruise and ballistic missile attacks rain out of Kaliningrad and into it from NATO return fire. The overwhelming amount of NATO firepower aimed at Kaliningrad quickly shuts down any hope of conducting air operations out of the enclave. But it's still a strong point of tens of thousands of Russian troops in armor who are manning defenses along the Polish border, while a separate thrust north into Lithuania seeks to destroy NATO forces there. Russia's hope is to sever NATO from the Baltic countries, and there's little the alliance can do to prevent that at the moment. Hour 3. In the Pacific, the Chinese Navy has begun the bombardment of the Penghu Islands, silencing naval defenses there. The massive amphibious assault force has crossed most of the Taiwan Strait, and the island fortress nation is now in sight. Overhead, Chinese fighters battle Taiwan's rapidly diminishing air force for supremacy, while other strike aircraft carry out SEAD operations, or suppression of enemy air defenses. Taiwan is equipped with very robust air defenses courtesy of America, and they take a heavy toll on the Chinese aircraft. China has over 2,000 combat aircraft, however, and is easily able to absorb the punishment. Lurking under the waves, though, the Chinese fleet runs into a coordinated Taiwanese and American ambush. US and Taiwanese subs have been powered down, lurking silently and awaiting the fleet's approach, and now, with the lead ships in range, they begin to open up on the Chinese Navy. Each submarine acts independently, but with attacks coming from multiple directions, there's little the Chinese ships can do to avoid destruction. Chinese anti-submarine warfare aircraft have been patrolling the strait for hours now, but the Chinese Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities have serious deficiencies. Their biggest problem, though, is that they're up against American Virginia-class submarines and Taiwan's electric diesel boats, both extremely quiet. Multiple Chinese vessels are sunk or heavily damaged, And in the chaos, the invasion fleet spread so as to avoid becoming an easy target. And that's when they run into hundreds of anti-ship mines deployed in advance by the Taiwanese Navy. The cost to the Chinese Navy is staggering, a satisfying payback for the losses the U.S. Navy suffered during China's ballistic missile barrage. But the sheer number of Chinese vessels means the invasion will carry on. Exposed by their attacks, the submarines make for a quick exit from the strait. They won't all make it, as Chinese destroyers and ASW aircraft score several hits. Hour 4. The air battle over Eastern Europe intensifies as both sides continue carrying SEAD operations against each other. For NATO, establishing air dominance is of critical importance as it's the best way to support outnumbered troops on the ground. Keeping NATO aircraft off the front is just as important for the Russian military to ensure the success of their ground forces. Without air superiority, the advantage is in the Russians' hands. Knowing that they couldn't guarantee the safety of strike aircraft against NATO's technologically advanced military, Russia has placed a focus on ground fire support platforms over air platforms. Russia's infantry is typically supported by far greater amounts of artillery than a comparable NATO unit, allowing them to bring far greater amounts of firepower to support their advance. In an environment currently lethal to strike aircraft, this gives Russia a sizable advantage at the front. However, this strategy also comes with serious limitations. Russia's forces are unable to exploit openings in the enemy's defenses for fear of outrunning their ground-based fire support and air defenses. As NATO forces reel from the Russian assault and fall back, NATO warplanes patiently wait for any Russian forces foolish enough to advance too quickly for their air defenses to protect. The Ukrainian war highlighted serious command and control issues for the Russian military, and while steps have been taken to correct the problem, Russian forces facing full-on electronic warfare from NATO and often out of contact with leadership for long periods of time occasionally move out of step with the rest of the advance. Those that do are immediately pounced on by NATO ground strike aircraft, who circle behind the front lines like hungry sharks. The bulk of the Russian force, however, maintains operational integrity and moves at a predetermined maximum advance rate, so as to keep under the protection of their ground-based fire support and air defenses. This makes their advance slow and predictable though, a fact that the vastly outnumbered NATO forces take full advantage of. Heavily damaged NATO units are able to withdraw and avoid full destruction, allowing them to regroup and redeploy. However, NATO has its own issues. Russian electronic warfare capabilities are wreaking havoc on NATO communications, and the fact that the alliance speaks over 24 different languages creates great difficulty coordinating the various components of the NATO defense force. English and French are the official languages of NATO, and most senior officers know one or both of them to ensure continuity of operations. But as communications are degraded and casualties mount, a lack of understanding makes it difficult for smaller units to operate together on the battlefield. The alliance is reeling from the onslaught and slowly but steadily losing ground. In the Pacific, American air power has yet to make an entry into the fight over Taiwan. Runways across South Korea, Japan, and even the Philippines face ongoing strikes from long-range Chinese missiles. The attacks have largely grounded air forces in the region, but they've come at a high cost by galvanizing Japan to join the fight. South Korea maintains neutrality despite attacks on 2 U.S. bases in its country and the death of some South Korean civilians and military personnel in the strikes. They are too preoccupied with a possible North Korean invasion instead. The Philippines remain similarly neutral despite their defense pact with the United States. Wary of joining the U.S. against China, countries all across the South Pacific are delaying their decisions on which side to back, as confidence in a U.S. victory is shaken by the losses incurred by America in the opening hours of the conflict. There is growing doubt that the U.S. will be able to effectively fight off the Chinese assault, as China's Navy and rocket forces keep U.S. forces at bay indefinitely. Backing the U.S. now could have disastrous consequences in a new world order in the Pacific led by China. Australia, however, is fully committed to its mutual defense pact with the U.S., and its forces prepare for deployment into the South Pacific. However, neither Japan nor Australia undertake any major air operations against China, instead ensuring territorial integrity and patrolling against any Chinese aerial incursion. Despite fears China would attack disputed Japanese islands, though, there is no attack, as the nation's focus is strictly on its pending invasion of Taiwan. Hour 5. Shore-based defenses rain hell on a swarm of Chinese amphibious assault vessels. The battle for Taiwan is on. China has decided to hit 3 different beaches simultaneously, 2 in the north and 1 in the south of the island. Because of the difficult undersea geography and suitability of the island's coast, there are only a few beaches where an amphibious assault is possible, and Taiwan has invested billions in their defense. Chinese forces first hit Gold Beach, the code word for a landing site outside of Taoyuan City. Shore-based batteries and mobile artillery open up on the approaching landing craft. Missiles streak into the sky, targeting the amphibious assault ships and their escorts over a dozen miles offshore. Landing craft and amphibious vehicles are being sunk by the dozens before the first finally makes it to the beach. By the time the first Chinese soldier steps foot on the Taiwanese mainland, 600 of his compatriots have already been killed or drowned. He doesn't fare much better, almost immediately getting gunned down by a hidden machine gun nest. A barrage of grenades destroys landing craft and all the men inside it. But there's many more landing craft coming. Gradually, the lead elements of the assault make successful landfall, but as the bulk of the assault force crosses an invisible line, the ocean suddenly erupts in flames. Hidden along the seafloor are long pipes through which the defenders pump raw oil. The oil floats to the surface before being set on fire, creating a raging inferno that floats along the top of the waves. The heat kills dozens of Chinese soldiers, even from inside the protection of their landing crafts. Large fan-powered landing ships carrying armored vehicles catch on fire and begin to sink as their rubber skirts deflate. The losses are horrendous, but still the assault keeps coming. Overhead, Chinese strike aircraft do what they can to neutralize the island's defenders, wiping out artillery positions with precision-guided weapons. However, many of these planes don't survive their attack run, blown out of the sky by Taiwan's robust air defenses. But the Chinese military has more planes than Taiwan has air defenses, and inevitably air defense sites are destroyed one by one through a combination of missile strikes and bombing runs. Taiwan's best defenses are its mobile defenses, self-propelled artillery and short-range air defense batteries. These prove difficult to track and pin down and are a deadly threat to scout aircraft trying to sniff them out. Taiwan's own air force rises to the occasion, but it's hopelessly outnumbered. Regardless, the island's defenders continue to put aircraft into the sky, operating from highways as most airfields in the country have now been damaged or effectively shut down. A half hour after the assault on Gold Beach begins, the Chinese open a second front directly north of Taipei. This assault meets with equally intense resistance, and huge Type 72 landing ships with bellies full of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles race to the beach. The second assault forces Taiwan to split its reserves as it rushes to ensure the Chinese can't gain a foothold, but Chinese airstrikes are making it difficult to quickly move troops around. A volley of missiles fly out from the beach and smash into the lead Type 72, causing massive damage to the ship and sinking it. The wrecked ship, heavily laden with troops and equipment, sinks quickly in the shallow water, and a second landing ship runs straight into the wreck, tearing its hull open. It too will sink in less than a minute, creating an artificial barrier for the ships. Regardless though, more ships continue the assault and despite the withering fire manage to make it to the beach. Ramps at their front open and the Chinese tanks and IFVs begin to pour out, to immediately be met by a flurry of American-made Javelin anti-tank missiles. Reactive armor on the Chinese tanks tries to deflect the incoming warheads but are largely unsuccessful against many of the most sophisticated tank-killing weapons in the world, and the US has provided thousands to Taiwan in anticipation of this invasion. A dozen miles away, Chinese air assault forces zip toward the coast in assault helicopters. To avoid air defenses, the pilots are flying at just above wave-top height in a daredevil sprint to get past the beaches. The moment they near land, though, they're forced to pull up to clear trees and buildings, which makes them easy targets for shoulder-fired air defense weapons. Numerous Chinese helicopters are blown out of the sky, but many make it to their destination, public squares and large parking lots pre-designated as air assault zones before the invasion. Chinese troops rush to secure defensive positions and coordinate. Their job is to seize key infrastructure across the invasion front and put pressure on the defenders' flanks. Taiwan counters with its mobile reserves, specifically kept out of fighting for just this reason. At several landing sites, Chinese troops are slaughtered as they're quickly overwhelmed, but the Chinese air assault manages to hold on to a few of its landing zones. The surviving assault helicopter fleet is already well on its way to the mainland and amphibious assault ships offshore to pick up more reinforcements. Taiwan holds the beaches, but under intense air attack, they'll be unable to fend off the Chinese troops for long. Hour 6. Somewhere deep behind Russian lines, a series of explosions lights up the early morning sky. Critical air defense radar immediately goes offline. More explosions 30 miles away eliminate a Russian command post. Flying at tens of thousands of feet over war-torn Eastern Europe, 2 American B-2s secretly forward deployed to Europe make their way back to friendly lines. They've flown a zigzag course to their targets, always presenting their stealthiest side to enemy radar. Russian radar technicians picked up an intermittent contact of something, but were unable to provide a firing solution to air defenses. On the way back to friendly lines, though, the B-2s are slightly more visible to ground and airborne radar, and several interceptors are vectored in on their approximate location. As they near the B-2s, their radars struggle to get a weapons-quality lock, as the B-2s take evasive action and defeat enemy radar by angling away from it. Still, it's only a matter of time before Russian MiGs have sniffed out the general location of the bombers and closed in enough that no amount of stealth technology can prevent a good lock. Suddenly, the lead MiG picks up a missile lock warning. Instinctively, he dives his plane, picking up speed and hoping to confuse the incoming missile with ground clutter. There's more warnings across the fleet of incoming interceptors as the MiGs attempt to scramble. The dividing MiGs desperately try to outmaneuver or outrun the incoming missiles, but the short detection range spells doom for many of the pilots. One by one, MiGs are blown out of the sky, with a few surviving and backing off the vulnerable B-2s. Somewhere in the dawn sky, a formation of American F-35s wheels to cover the B-2's retreat. They're some of the few operational F-35s NATO has in service, and though deadly to Russian air defenses, are too few in number to significantly alter the air war. The B-2s must also be used judiciously, as they too are few in number to significantly damage Russia's ability to fight. Hour 24. It's been 1 day since the start of the Third World War. The Sino-Russian alliance has pushed NATO back significantly in the Baltic states as America rushes to recall troops on leave and prepare to embark reinforcements to Europe. It'll take weeks for the US to be ready for ground operations, even with the world's largest logistical fleet preparing around-the-clock flights to Europe. NATO is rushing to marshal a response force in Poland as the Polish military reinforces its defenses on its border with Russia-held Ukraine and Kaliningrad. After a day of fierce fighting, it's not expected that NATO will hold on to its Baltic allies for long, though that was always expected. NATO navies have initiated a sting of anti-submarine defenses that stretch from Greenland to Iceland and to the UK to help safeguard US troop ships as the first rushed reinforcements begin to load onto ships on the US East and Gulf coasts. In the Baltic Sea, fierce fighting between NATO ships and the Russian Navy has kept Russian naval firepower at bay. As it has so often found itself throughout history, Russia is unable to put its fleets to sea, outnumbered and outgunned by superior NATO navies. French and Spanish aircraft carriers have moved into the Mediterranean and are steaming toward the Black Sea, where the Turkish Navy has been securing the Bosphorus Strait and cutting it off to Russian trade. From the Black Sea, NATO ships can harass Russia's southern flank with long-range missiles and airstrikes, though they still face stiff defenses based out of Crimea. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy and Air Force have yet to stage a counterattack against Chinese forces. Ongoing missile attacks have kept the U.S. fleet far out at sea and out of range of launching their own attacks. Losses continue to mount as Chinese land-based missile strikes seek out American ships or sink and cripple them. However, the number of missiles in the Chinese inventory is rapidly diminishing. On Taiwan, the first 2 beach assaults have failed, leading China to cancel their assaults. Over 5,000 Chinese soldiers lie dead on or just off of Taiwan's northern beaches. Chinese air assaults have met with similar failures, but thanks to fierce air support, 2 of the landing sites remain in Chinese control. It's cost the Chinese Air Force dearly, though, with over 50 aircraft destroyed in the first day of fighting alone. Across the island, Chinese special forces inserted secretly onto the island prior to the invasion have struck out at Taiwanese political and military leadership. Several prominent politicians are either under arrest or dead. Efforts to evacuate senior Taiwanese leadership to the mainland, where they can be used for propaganda purposes, have ended in failure, and Taiwan's president remains out of grasp with Chinese kill teams. Rather than allow Taiwan to recapture officials, Chinese special forces execute them. Hour 48. Tankers have been escorting U.S. fighter and bomber aircraft across the Pacific non-stop for the last 2 days. The bulk of the U.S. Air Forces now are stationed in civilian and military airfields across Japan, as the Japanese self-defense forces successfully fend off the worst of China's continued but diminished missile attacks. Losses to U.S. aircraft on the ground remain significant, but enough aircraft are operational to begin offensive operations. The Chinese fleet has reinitiated amphibious assaults against Taiwan under the cover of a vicious air campaign. Most of Taiwan's air defenses have been neutralized by now, including the majority of the Taiwanese Air Force. However, as the assault commences, Chinese airborne radar detects a massive air assault of F-15 and F-18s, backed up with multiple tankers and EWACs for support. The F-18s have been launched from the surviving Pacific Fleet carriers and ferried to their destination with the support of drone tankers. The U.S. Air Force's F-15s have been flying for hours from Japanese air bases, accompanied by their Japanese allies. The U.S. and Japanese tanker fleet has remained in orbit around the seas south of Japan, topping off the massive air fleet and ready to help fuel-starved combatants return home. The largest air battle of modern war is about to begin. Chinese interceptors move to defend the amphibious assault from both the northern and eastern air assault. China's lack of aircraft carriers forces the fighters to remain close to Taiwan's shore, which exposes them to surviving air defense units, forcing the Chinese to turn on afterburners and try to meet the American and Japanese forces out at sea. There's another reason for trying to close the distance as rapidly as possible, and it becomes apparent as the first missile lock warnings ring out across the cockpits of Chinese fighters. Stealthy F-22s and F-35s are leading the assault, launching new generation long-range air-to-air missiles at the Chinese jets. The result is dramatic, as Chinese fighters are forced to dive to try to juke off the American missiles. With 2 missiles fired at each hostile, many Chinese fighters fail to shake off the missiles and are splashed. But stealth fighters have one inherent weakness. They have a very low missile capacity due to the need to carry all weapons internally. Spent even before making visual contact, the F-22s are forced to turn around, but the F-35s press the attack. Their data link capabilities allow them to guide non-stealthy fighter weapons to targets, while keeping the vulnerable 4th-generation fighters away from the enemy jets. Another wave of missiles scream across the sky guided by F-35s that the Chinese are having difficulty picking up on radar. But the Chinese have an improved air-to-air missile with a range in excess of 200 miles, and they launch their own volleys back at the Americans and Japanese. They can't target the F-35s yet, but the F-18s and F-15s give off massive radar returns and are easy prey for the improved Chinese missiles. Friendly aircraft tumble out of the sky as the Chinese press into visual range of the attack. The F-35s immediately break off. They're not built for close-quarters combat. The F-15s and F-18s, however, are. Chinese J-10s, J-16s, and Su-30s are fine aircraft, but the F-15 Fighting Eagle has proven it is the superior machine in conflicts around the world. For every F-15 downed, 4 enemy aircraft are splashed. The battle is far from decisive, but American and Japanese strike aircraft are able to penetrate Chinese air cover and deliver devastating blows to the assembled Chinese fleet. Air defenses have a difficult time taking out the attacking aircraft thanks to their use of long-range standoff attack munitions. Missile defenses, however, do their best to fend off the attack and succeed with a kill rate of about 60%. But many Chinese ships are still struck and either sunk or rendered combat ineffective. By the end of the second day of fighting, America has finally struck back in an inconclusive air battle that saw both sides take steep losses. Its fleet of stealthy F-22s and F-35s, however, remains largely intact, but it's feared that there are simply too few to carry on the fight. Conspicuously, China's Chengdu J-20 has yet to make an appearance on the battlefield. Despite the setback in the air, China has managed to secure a beachhead on Taiwan. Now the unloading of the massive Chinese army can begin, but Taiwanese resistance is far from broken. Over in Europe, NATO forces in the Baltic states are exhausted and overwhelmed, with many surrendering to the Russians. It'll be a few days yet, but Russia is on the verge of reclaiming lost Soviet territories. However, the war is far from over, and NATO will quickly be capable of launching massive ground assaults against Russia, starting with Kaliningrad. Hour 72. Fierce fighting rages on in the major cities of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, but NATO's 40,000-strong response force has been neutralized by Russian forces. The cost has been steep, but with conventional forces largely defeated in the Baltics, the massive Russian war machine begins to swing south towards Kaliningrad, which has been decimated by ongoing missile attacks. The battle for the heart of Europe will commence in days, as NATO uses Poland as a staging ground for its counterattack. In the Pacific, U.S. losses of ships and aircraft are steep, and additional material from the U.S.'s other global commands is being rushed to the Pacific. However, Chinese losses are even steeper. In a race of attrition, China will ultimately lose. Hence, it's vital that Taiwan be captured as quickly as possible. U.S. forces, however, have begun a naval blockade of China, cutting it off from its naval trade routes. Sensing an opportunity to seriously weaken its regional rival, India joins in the blockade, sealing China off from importing the oil and natural gas it desperately needs. Land supply routes to Russia are still available, but the steep drop in supply causes energy prices to skyrocket. Like Russia discovered in Ukraine, Taiwanese resistance to hostile invaders is stiff and deadly. Chinese troops are engaged in fierce street fighting, with civilian militias taking up arms provided by the government against the invaders. The Taiwanese people have no desire to be a part of Xi Jinping's China, and they make the People's Liberation Army pay dearly for every inch of Taiwan they take. Hour 168. Across Chinese social media, images of the ghastly cost of the Taiwan invasion are being spread. Taiwanese and American cyber warfare agents have managed to penetrate the Chinese Great Firewall, and now photos and videos of the devastation in Taiwan are being spread faster than Chinese censors can stop it. The Chinese people have for generations been told that a conquest of Taiwan would be easy and bloodless, but the high cost in terms of human lives is now clear for all of China to see. The Chinese Communist Party has used the state media apparatus to lie about casualty figures, reporting only a trickle of casualties each day, hoping to keep the public outrage down. Anger and outrage quickly builds. In Europe, NATO's second response force has engaged Russian forces across the length of the Polish border. Russian air defense batteries have been greatly attrited through ongoing strikes against them, but the cost has been high for the pilots of Europe's air forces. American stealth aircraft are badly needed in the Pacific, and the job of suppressing Russian air defenses falls on Europe's largely non-stealth air force. The outcome of World War III will be decided in Poland and Taiwan. Hour 336. 2 weeks after the start of World War III, the momentum of the Russian war machine has begun to stall out in light of stiff and well-organized resistance by NATO forces. The invasion of Ukraine has proven that the much-feared Russian military juggernaut is a clumsy giant, defeated more by its own ineptitude than foreign military powers. While Western armies place a strong emphasis on logistics, Russian military forces have approximately 25% the logistics personnel of NATO militaries. This means massive convoys of Russian vehicles stuck on the side of roads and highways, starved of fuel and ammunition. Russian troops, especially its conscript force, is suffering from catastrophically low morale as they come under fire from advanced NATO weapon systems. Surrenders of entire units are growing increasingly common, and the high casualties are causing a massive political dissent back home. Strong-handed police tactics against anti-war protesters can barely restrain the tide of malcontent sweeping across Russia, and Vladimir Putin's hold on power grows more tenuous by the day. While the Russian attack hasn't been repelled, it has been ground to a halt just inside Poland's borders. The arrival of a large American army unit on the continent marks the beginning of offensive operations for NATO, and the future looks grim for a Russian military suffering from bad equipment, low morale, and terrible logistics. The Russian Air Force, however, continues to perform well, though equipment and maintenance shortfalls have begun affecting it as well. Slowly but surely, European NATO forces have wrestled control of the skies away from Russia, and over the coming day, Russian frontline units will be exposed to the full wrath of NATO air support. In the Pacific, China has maintained its hold on the western half of Taiwan, but at a staggering cost. Over 15,000 Chinese troops are dead or wounded, but the Chinese Communist Party works hard to keep those figures hidden from an increasingly angry Chinese public. They were promised a swift victory over the tiny island, and that the United States could be defeated in the Pacific with China's advanced missiles and aircraft. Neither of these have proven true, and while the US has suffered massive losses of ships and planes, it's able to replenish losses faster than the Chinese Navy and Air Force. Taiwan's defenders have so far repelled China's attempts to push through the east of the island, and now American Marines are arriving in force. To the world's great surprise, US Marines are backed up by Japanese troops, who have revoked their pacifist constitution in the name of regional defense against an aggressive China. But it's not just the Japanese joining the US in defending Taiwan, as the Australians join America in defense of the Pacific. China alone in the region with no friends is now facing the monumental task of defeating three major powers simultaneously. As losses mount for the Sino-Russian alliance, both Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin consider their final option. Nuclear power is the great equalizer, and the one way that Russia can overcome NATO's overmatch of its own military forces. But for every one strike that Russia or China may undertake, NATO will respond with two in an escalatory ladder that will end with the world in ashes.